Right now, let's turn our attention to one final story before Mike Graham is here to tell us what's happening on his show in just a couple of moments, and that is a trigger warning on Jane Austen. Deep sighs, everybody. Yes, a trigger warning has been added to sexist Jane Austen novel Northanger Abbey at the University of Greenwich. Students there have been told that the novel, published in 1817, is for gender stereotyping. The warning is for gender stereotyping. The students taking English literature classes told that the satire contains toxic relationships and friendships. I mean, seriously, if you are really worried about a Jane Austen novel, guys, you should not be at university. In fact, you probably shouldn't leave your house. Go and live in a little bubble under your bed. Let's talk to Alice Grant, who's a political commentator and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia. Thank you so much for having me on.
The usual madness going on. I mean, we've had trigger warnings on everything. I mean, you know, people, archaeology students having a trigger warning about seeing bones, medical students seeing human bodies, and pretty much every book, film, piece of artwork ever made. I have to say, I don't think I've ever. I'm a big Jane Austen fan, but I don't think I've ever read Northanger Abbey. I mean, they're saying that the issue is that it's the relationships are unhealthy. It's a young woman coming of age in Regency Britain, trials and tribulations. Basically, some of these relationships are not suitable for the 21st century. Why would anyone expect them to be?
Yeah. The way they're trying to infantilise our generation, I completely just, think this is ridiculous in substance and in principle. I mean, we're talking here also about Jane Austen, one of the greatest female writers, and
one of the greatest writers.
she's exactly, but I mean, the point is that they're trying to make a point that her novels are in some way sexist, but I disagree, and it's about interpretation, and so many people look to her as someone who actually is able to kind of challenge female gender stereotypes through her writing. But even besides that, this is very kind of Labour right politics that we're seeing, and I think on a wider point, I'd say that we have to be very careful with the way our nation is heading. And
yeah, I completely agree with that. I've always thought, actually,
with power, we might be seeing a lot more of this kind of infantilizing of not only university students, but perhaps the rest of Britain.
We've been infantilizing everybody, though, and we all thought that when university students came out of uni, they'd face the real world, and they'd have it, frankly, slapped out of them. No, now they're taking over the workplace too, aren't they?
Indeed.
But I've always thought of Jane Austen as actually quite a feminist in terms of her characters. We think, Emma is actually, she's using the power that she has as a woman in that age, in that social class, to basically be quite controlling as well. But and try, but the small power that women who had no agency of their own could do. Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth is a wonderfully strong feminist character, but this idea that you shouldn't represent what relationships were like then, and what relationships, frankly, were like until about 50, 60 years ago for women in this country.
No, indeed, and I think some of the feminist writers which I studied, during secondary school, in fact, dealt with so much more toxic relationships, and they were supposedly being a voice for women just because they were writing in, the 70s, and it's just ridiculous to suggest that Jane Austen's novels should need a trigger warning, and some of these writers which I studied in secondary school don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are far more worse writers out there who, just because they have the feminist label, aren't receiving the same attention.
But I don't think anything should have a trigger warning. The only thing I want a trigger warning for, and a trigger warning was simply, I would like to be told in advance, this is a graphically violent novel. Well, then I don't want to read it. Thanks very much. I just don't want to. That's just not stuff I want to read. I don't like horror. Don't like any of that stuff. Now that's fine. People to be told, but not a warning, but just informative. This contains this, or I don't necessarily want to read a whole load of porn, frankly, very much. But that's a different thing, isn't it?
But I also think there's a reason why often those labels are directed at children and at children's material. I mean, here we're talking about a university and a Gothic literature model. I'm sure if you choose that, you're essentially accepting the fact that you will come across content which might be slightly disturbing, seeing as it's Gothic literature. But obviously, they're too focused on trying to infantilize universities.
Infantilize all of us. It's quite bizarre, isn't it? Alice Grant, who's a political commentator, thank you so much for joining us.